The next question is unapologetically focused on our location. And some of the members of our congregations have been directly involved in supporting Walking the Path of Peace Together. It's a project initiated by Faith United Church in partnership with members of the local Indigenous community. And the focus is on building an Indigenous sovereignty garden on the outskirts of the city. But it's much more. We're grateful for the financial support from the Indigenous Justice and Reconciliation to support this work, and excited at the prospect that this land, originally purchased for a church building in the late 1980s, will soon be repatriated to a Indigenous-led charitable nonprofit land trust. At the same time, we're sensitive to the financial burdens that the responsibility of this land transfer will place on the new land trust. What do you see as the elements of a United Church policy on reparations to support fledgling projects such as Walking the Path of Peace Together during a transition period to ensure their long-term success?
I think that's our next big denominational conversation, is around reparations, and not only for Indigenous people, for examining all, but especially for Indigenous people, but not only. So, the question of reparations for, unwed mothers' homes, or people who faced other forms of discrimination or marginalization in the church, or where the church benefited from Japanese internment, for example. But especially Indigenous reparations, I think, is important. So the other thing I'm doing this weekend in Victoria, besides the Resurrect Party, is I'm the keynote speaker at the UVic joint lecture with the Diocese of British Columbia, called the John Albert Hall Lectures, and the theme for this year is land law and reconciliation. I think the very, very first thing that we should do as a bare minimum is look at our church properties on reserve, because the way that reservations work, for better or for worse, is that 100% of the reserve is Crown land held in trust for the Indigenous inhabitants of it. And the size of the reserve was determined largely during the McKenna-McBride Commission, where there was a certain amount of property that was set aside per capita based on these 100-year-old numbers. And the size of the reserves have not increased as our Indigenous population has increased. But when churches existed on reserves, the churches were given fee simple title to the lots that the church were on, that the church and the manse were on. So I think in Bella Bella, where my mom is from, I think there's still 7 fee simple title lots that are held by the church in the middle of this reserve. That was the same in Alert Bay too. So I think it was actually my great-great-grandfather that I know he paid to have the church built. I don't know if he bought the land that the church was on in the reserve, in the Numgus Reserve in Alert Bay. But in the 1980s, my mom worked with the Numgus community in Alert Bay to have the Diocese of British Columbia give the land back to the Numgus First Nation. So the church is still on reserve, but like the rest of entities on reserve, they don't own the land. They just they own the buildings that are on the land. They own the real estate. So for me, the bare minimum is for the church to look at, where do we own lots? Where do we have fee simple title to lots that are on reserve, and to sell those? Sell them for $1 to the tribal council. It doesn't have to be super complicated. I think it gets more complicated when you move off reserve. But I think as we've created Kindred Works to look at the ways that we manage our church assets, and in part to redevelop the 10% or so of our properties that would work for creating secure rental housing for middle income Canadians, which is really Kindred Works model, right? They're not going to come in and create 100% charitable housing like what we did at First United, but they're also developing a property management arm. And so they're looking at all of the ways that our church properties across the country can be best served. But sometimes dispossession of our property is going to be the best way forward. If we have, 7 churches in a neighborhood that we don't, I think that's rarer and rarer, but we don't need to keep all of those buildings. You could give right of first refusal to Indigenous communities or groups. It doesn't necessarily have to be a land trust for an Indigenous-led organization. It could be looking at which First Nations have a land claim for that area and approaching them, like, do they want to buy this asset back from the church, and maybe at like a less than market rate as part of the reparations, right? So like we're not gonna get like the very, very most we can if we were going to sell to a developer or to a city, but making it affordable for Indigenous people to buy fee simple title back to their communities so that they can start to grow the amount of land that they have control over. If selling to a developer or another private owner is the best way forward, then maybe a percentage of that either goes to fund our own Indigenous ministries or the local Indigenous people in the area where the church property is. So, but I think we also, one of the reasons why Kindred Works was formed is because we were making these sort of like property by property decisions around, congregations deciding what they wanted to do with their buildings and proposing it to their conference or their region. I think that one of the things we've talked about in the General Council Executive is develop, just like we have this work that we're doing on a principles-based approach to justice work, is to develop a principles-based approach to reparations. And how are we going to live the both and of like wanting to maintain enough resources that we don't continue to shrink as a denomination, and balance that with the fact that we have $4 billion worth of property, and we can probably share some of that and return some of that back to Indigenous people in this country.
Thank you.